Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council. The most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. Before we get into this week's episode, a quick message from the BCRC.
Many studies have shown that preconditioned calves can achieve a lower cost of gain at the feedlot, along with improved rates of gain, better feed efficiency, and reduced treatment rates and death loss. Since preconditioning also comes with economic considerations, the BCRC's Preconditioning and Backgrounding Calculator helps producers evaluate the potential opportunity by summarizing estimated net returns and projected break-even price premiums across 3 different preconditioning programs. This episode features the BCRC's Science Director, Dr. Reynold Bergen.
Hi there, I'm Reynold. This Research on the Record article originally appeared in the September 2025 issue of Canadian Cattleman magazine, and we've reposted it on the beefresearch.ca site with the publisher's permission. And today we're going to talk about the last word, for now anyway, on cattle rest stops during long-distance transport. So in the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, that's the CFIA, when they began to muse about requiring that cattle be unloaded and provided with a rest stop after 36 hours of transportation, Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, and Canada's beef industry funded a series of research projects led by Karen Schwarzkopf-Genswein in Lethbridge to determine whether those rest stops would benefit weaned calves. So that research began before the regulations were revised, but then the regulations were revised before the research could be completed. We've written about this before, so it's a bit of a refresher from some of these past projects. So they did 3 consecutive research trials in 2018, 2019, and 2020. And every one of those found that providing a rest stop during long-haul transportation did not offer any consistent, measurable benefits for animal welfare. So you've heard about those before, but what's a little bit new is that at the same time, there was a companion project led by Trevor Alexander, who's also at Ag Canada in Lethbridge. And what he was doing was looking at the bacterial populations in the respiratory tract of those same calves. So I talked about this once back in 2023. And that was from the 2018 study where they found that rested calves actually had more bovine respiratory disease, so more BRD bacteria in their respiratory tract than the calves that just went from point A to point B without a stop in between. Now, the write-ups on all those projects are available at beefresearch.ca if you're interested or if you want a refresher. What we're going to talk about today is the microbiological results from the 2019 and 2020 transport trials. Those papers have now been published, and the online version of this article has a link to that paper if you want to read them. So what they did, to recap, is that in the fall of 2019, there were 320 freshly weaned crossbred steer calves, all from the same ranch. They went to the research station. When they got there, they processed them and adapted them to the feedlot diet and environment for 4 weeks, which is a bit weird, right? Because these are newly weaned calves and we want to study their effect to transport. So why would we adapt them to the feedlot? And well, the reason they did that was they wanted to make sure that the effects of weaning stress were passed and wouldn't interfere with the response to transport. So they let them adapt to the feedlot for 4 weeks. And then after that, they did the transport trial. So they loaded all these calves, they hauled them all for 36 hours, and then they unloaded them. Half of those calves were immediately put back on the trailer and hauled for 4 more hours back to the research facility. The other half of them were rested in pens with bedding and feed and water for 12 hours, and then they were reloaded and hauled for the final 4 hours to get to the research station. Now, in the next year, in the 2020 trial, they used 328 calves, again, freshly weaned calves from 2 different ranches this time. And again, they were processed at the research station like the year before, but this time they were not allowed to acclimate to the feedlot environment. They were loaded and hauled for 20 hours. So that's roughly about how long it takes to get from Lethbridge to Thunder Bay. And then they unloaded them. Half of those calves were immediately reloaded and hauled for another 15 hours back to the research facility. So that 15 hours is roughly about the amount of time it would take to get from Thunder Bay over to Kincardine in Ontario. So that's kind of what they're trying to simulate there. The other half of the calves were rested for 8 hours with feed, water, and bedding, and then they were reloaded and hauled the final 15 hours to the research site. Now, in both of those trials, they collected deep nasopharyngeal swabs. And so you can imagine a giant Q-tip that stuck up the nose all the way to the back of the nose. They swirl it around and then keep that sample and look at the bacteria. So they collected those swabs from some of the rested calves and some of the unrested calves before they were loaded at the very start of the trial. They sampled them when they were unloaded after the first leg of the trip. They sampled them again before they were reloaded after the rest period. They sampled them again when they got to the research station, and then they sampled them periodically over the next month when they were on feed. Now, the research team then looked at those samples they collected, and they looked at the different proportions of different bacteria in those samples and assessed whether providing a rest stop affected the prevalence of different kinds of bacteria in the respiratory tract. So what they learned was that the most abundant bacteria identified in all of the samples included Mannheimia and Pasteurella and Histophilus and Mycoplasma, and those are all bacteria that are involved in BRD. They also found a lot of Moraxella, which is a bacteria that's sometimes found in BRD. And they also found a bacteria called Streptococcus, which is related to BRD because what it can do is produce an enzyme that breaks down the mucus. And the mucus lines the respiratory tract and helps protect it from bacterial infection. And so it can predispose calves to BRD. So all of those bacteria were the most common ones in all the calves. But when they looked at the calves that had been rested, they had more of all of those bacteria, except for Pasteurella, than the calves that were unrested. So point being that BRD bacteria were more prevalent in calves that were given a rest stop than in calves that went right from point A to point B. So what does all this mean to you? Well, none of these three transport trials showed that providing a rest stop during long-distance transport provided a clear or consistent benefit of any sort for the health or welfare of feeder calves. Now, these three microbiome studies that were added to that now provide consistent evidence that rest stops may actually pose a risk to the health of those calves. Now, the experimental groups they used here, they were too small to measure statistically meaningful differences in actual illness due to BRD. We've talked about that before. But that said, BRD treatments were, numerically more common among rested calves than among unrested calves. So in 2019, there were 11 rested calves that got treated for BRD versus 7 unrested calves. And then in 2020, there were 17 rested calves that needed to be treated versus 8 unrested calves. So those numbers aren't big enough to do a statistical comparison, but the trend is concerning, as they say. So the bottom line is that Canada's beef industry and Agriculture Canada funded those studies so that we would have the information that the CFIA would need to formulate science-based updates to Canada's cattle transport regulations. Unfortunately, the new requirement to require a minimum 8-hour rest stop was imposed before the research could be completed. We remain hopeful that the CFIA will take this science into consideration and rethink that rest stop requirement. It's not too late to do the right thing. We know there's similar research going on elsewhere with younger calves, so we'll see what that research shows. Anyway, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.